Streaming live on Facebook, if you don't mind checking, Chris.
Okay. Hello and welcome to the California Preservation Foundation and the California State Historic Preservation Office Climate Change Task Force special meeting. We will be getting started in 3 minutes. Hello and welcome to the California Preservation Foundation. We'll be starting our webinar in about 2 minutes. Hello and welcome to the California Preservation Foundation. We'll be starting this webinar in 1 minute. In the meantime, you can see the programs that we've hosted this week. If you are registered for the conference, you will get recordings for all of these included with your registration, and you'll get a link in about a week. Today, we're hosting the Climate Change Task Force meeting. It will be getting started in 1 minute. Hello, everyone. This is Chris Madrid French, and we're back for another interesting conversation with the California Preservation Foundation. Today, we are co-hosting with the California State Historic Preservation Office, the Cultural Resources Climate Change Task Force. Special meeting will be occurring today between 9 and noon. We encourage you to use the chat window for your comments. You can go ahead and post where you're calling in from in the chat, and also use the Q&A box for any questions that you might have as we go through the agenda. I'll be posting that agenda in the chat box shortly. But first, I would like to introduce Julie Polanco. You can go ahead and turn on your image and your microphone.
Good morning,
Welcome.
everyone. So nice to see you
Welcome,
all.
Julie. You go ahead, take it away.
Great, thanks. I think we're still waiting for our keynote though, Chris.
Oh, I'm back then. Then I'll just ask you a couple of questions, Julie. Why don't you update us on the mission behind this task force meeting today?
Yeah, so the California Cultural Resources Climate Change Task Force, which we'll go into in depth the history of it, so what our workings are, where we are now and where we're headed, was really born out of an idea that cultural heritage, people, their traditions, histories, and stories are all important to our everyday living, and climate change both affects cultural heritage in our communities, as well as culture can be a way for people to, a place for people to understand what kind of behavioral changes they need to make in their own daily lives in order to meet these goals of the 1.5 degree global temperature of the Paris Agreement. So it really is about how do we partner and work better together. We're so excited to have everyone with us today, and the first of what we hope to be several listening sessions to get input from the public in our tribes to understand where we're on target and what people's goals are. So we'll spend some more time today doing that, and we look forward to the end to open it up for questions and participation from our audience. So thanks so much.
Wonderful. We'll start again. I see that our keynote speaker is here, so I'd like to introduce Julie again. And Julie, why don't you go ahead and take it away from here?
Okay, thank you. Good morning, everyone again. I am Julie Polanco. I have the great honor and pleasure of being your State Historic Preservation Officer. It's my pleasure and delight to introduce Amanda Hansen, who joined the California Natural Resources Agency in April of 2019 as the agency's Deputy Secretary for Climate Change. In this role, she drives agency's efforts to build California's resilience to climate impacts and accelerate the contribution of nature-based solutions to meet our ambitious climate goals. She also coordinates the agency's national and international climate engagement. Amanda previously worked on climate issues for the Governor of New York, the White House Council on Environmental Quality, and the US Department of State. I will say that Amanda in her role has really embraced cultural heritage and its contributions, and we're just delighted to have you to share with us today. Amanda, thanks for being here.
Thank you, and thanks to everyone for being here today. It's really a pleasure to be able to help kind of set the stage for the discussions moving forward. Julie asked me to provide some background and sort of landscape of California's work to build climate resilience. And so I hope that I do this effort some justice here. As Julie mentioned, I'm the Deputy Secretary for Climate Change at the Natural Resources Agency. And this role, very luckily, involves supporting the coordination of the state's climate adaptation strategy every 3 years. And that is an incredible sort of honor and opportunity that I'll dig into in a little bit, but wanted to sort of explain why this is of particular interest to the Resources Agency and an area of focus for our secretary. I think I'd like to just start, if I can, with a little bit of background on our approach. So, big picture, California or climate action is really sort of divided into two, although many of the actions that we can take to deliver on each one support the other. So we have climate mitigation and we have climate adaptation. And I wanted to just start by sort of explaining what the difference is so that when I say climate action, people can track what I'm talking about. And that when I say mitigation or adaptation, it's all very clear. So climate mitigation is what we call our efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, to sequester carbon, to achieve carbon neutrality, to achieve the goals that are set out in statute for us to be a better global player on the issue of climate change and emissions. So that is climate mitigation. And climate adaptation is the work that we do to reduce the risks of climate change to people and to communities and to nature, natural systems, and to build resilience to the impacts of climate change that are coming. And so climate action is the whole made up of climate mitigation efforts and climate adaptation efforts. All of this work that we do in California is underpinned by best available science. So as we think about how are we going to reduce our emissions, how are we going to build climate resilience, we are investing in research and science to understand and inform our decisions all along the way. And I'll get into a little bit more detail in that in a bit here. In California, we have two overarching strategies on climate. One is focused on climate mitigation, and the other is focused on climate adaptation. The scoping plan is our climate mitigation strategy, essentially. It lays out how are we going to reduce our emissions and hit those targets set out in statute in a way that is technologically feasible and going to allow our legacy of reducing emissions while also growing our economy in the future. So there is a significant amount of work that goes into the scoping plan, and it involves modeling. So there are a number of different sort of futures that we might experience in California. And these are global models that are utilized to understand, assuming each one of those futures and this technology, this policy, this regulation, will we reduce our emissions by X amount by Y year? The scoping plan this year, for the very first time, integrated the question, how will we achieve carbon neutrality? And that's a different approach to our mitigation strategy, because we're not just talking about reducing our emissions, we're talking about getting to zero. And in order to get to zero, because of technology and the need to the difficulty in actually reducing emissions to zero, we are also integrating and considering how are we going to sequester carbon to make up for what we can't get rid of. So if we have this much remaining in our economy, how can we make sure that we're pulling that out of the atmosphere, either through a natural solution, which is what trees, plants, grasses, roots can do, soils, or through engineered solutions, such as carbon capture and storage, direct air capture. So the scoping plan is updated every 5 years, and we're in the process of updating it now. A draft was released, I think it was last month. And so I really encourage all of you to take a look at it, and it will be finalized later this year. I'll just sort of, as an aside, mention that because we're asking, how are we going to achieve carbon neutrality by 2045? The sector of climate action that we refer to as natural and working lands has been incorporated in the scoping plan in a very robust way for the first time, because we want to understand how much will our lands contribute to or exacerbate our climate change efforts. So I'm going to transition now. That's the first overarching climate strategy that California has. Our other overarching strategy is the climate adaptation strategy. This is also mandated by statute, and the legislature requires that we update it every 3 years. And this strategy was updated in 2021. We released the final a few months back, and we've taken a different approach to the climate adaptation strategy this year, which I'll just sort of walk through at a high level. I think the impacts of climate change are accelerating to the point where we really need to be nimble, and we need to move together in an aligned way to the fullest extent that we can. And so rather than create sort of a static document that doesn't change for a 3-year period, considering what has happened in the last 3 years, we just felt that that wasn't the right approach, that instead of a document, it would make more sense to have a website that people can go to understand, okay, what's the strategy in California and how are we doing? So we'll be able to update it more often than every 3 years and sort of demonstrate where we're achieving our progress. It also includes, for the first time, clear success metrics and timetables for achieving those success metrics, which is important, again, to be able to demonstrate where we are doing well, where we maybe need to pick up the pace or address a gap, and also help people understand where there might be a need for action. The other thing that's pretty different about this strategy is that instead of being organized by sector, so agriculture, transportation, natural working lands, we decided that really what we need to do in order to help push sort of aligned action to build resilience in California, that we would organize the state's adaptation strategy around 6 outcome-based priorities to guide all of our efforts. These priorities include things like protecting the most vulnerable communities, making decisions based on best available science, ensuring that we're building a climate resilient economy. And so we really hope that these 6 priorities can help people understand what is it that we should be driving toward when we're trying to take resilience action in California. And when people are applying for grant programs or thinking about ways that they can partner with the state, that we're being very clear about what it is that where our priorities are and what we're trying to achieve. So we're looking forward to continuing to partner with all of the agencies that contributed to that strategy moving forward as we do our updates and submit reports to the legislature on our progress that we've made. Each of those big overarching strategies really reflect an incredible amount of intellectual firepower, strategic thinking, existing plans across all of these various sectors in California. So transportation, housing, labor, water, education, health, energy. And, any of these plans that, various agencies have that will help deliver on our mitigation goals, those are considered in the scoping plan process. Similarly, efforts underway across agencies that work in specific sectors to build climate resilience, those were considered as we built out our climate adaptation strategy. So what I'm trying to explain is that adaptation and climate mitigation, these are things that are, these are actions underway across all of our agencies and being sort of driven by folks everywhere in state government, and that we're all sort of driving in the same direction in our specific sector areas of focus. I will sort of lastly just say, California has been experiencing climate impacts over the last decade that have just been overwhelming. And it is very clear that this is not building climate resilience, adapting to climate change. This is not, as our secretary likes to say, this is not a future planning exercise. This is a crisis, and one that's going to take all of us, really, truly all of us, in our own work and life to address and to build the future that our children deserve. So, we've spent a lot of time on climate mitigation in California, very early leaders in that space, continue to be leaders in that space. And we are really raising our A game as it relates to climate resilience, given the fact that there have been such incredible impacts that we've experienced in California. We had an incredible climate budget. I believe we've proposed almost $40 billion over the last 2 years to support climate action in California. And I'm just really incredibly proud of the way that this administration has been thoughtful about those investments. And I'll just, what do I mean by that? I mean, you know, there are ways that agencies do their work. And many, I think, have said, well, I'm not really quite sure how our efforts really drive on climate, or they've said these efforts drive on climate, but it's not necessarily how they're sort of characterized. They're characterized as we're building public health, or we're driving on clean energy. And what we've really done is try to take an all hands on deck approach, where we're being very clear about the work that's underway across all these agencies that will drive on our climate change goals in California. So you see in these budget proposals, all sectors engaged: education, health, transportation, labor, et cetera. In addition to some of the more traditional environmental agencies, it really is the work of all of us. And I think with that, maybe I'll hand it back over to Julie to help ask a couple questions or moderate. And thanks everyone again for your time.
Well, Amanda, thank you so much. That really is so helpful to set the stage for today and give us the broader perspective of the state's climate ambition, and really then start to, in the next coming sessions, we'll really start to do a bit of a deeper dive into where culture plays roles, how it can help. I'm wondering if you might speak to the 30 by 30 working in natural lands. I know that's something that you spearheaded, and how you see people being front and center in those processes, and maybe give us a little bit of information about the goals of that particular portion of the climate ambition.
Sure, happy to, thanks. In the fall of 2020, Governor Newsom issued an executive order essentially calling on California to integrate nature into our approach to addressing climate change and protecting biodiversity. And so the executive order called for sort of two strategies to help drive on this pillar of action. The first was the strategy. Well, first of all, the executive order committed California to conserving 30% of our lands and coastal waters by 2030. And this is sort of referred to as 30 by 30. And it was spearheaded by an international group of scientists who essentially said, if we do not conserve 30% of our lands and waters globally, we're in big trouble. And so California committed. We were the first state to commit to 30 by 30, and we were followed by the federal government. And so we're really serious about achieving that goal. And this is a voluntary effort, so we know we're going to need to partner with folks across the state to make this work. And when we think about what we want to conserve, we really want to be driving on sort of three critical priorities. The first is protecting biodiversity. The second is increasing access to nature, and the third for people. And then the third is addressing climate change. So those are the three sort of areas of consideration for, will this conservation count toward achieving 30 by 30? Because just sort of putting up a fence around an area and calling it conserved and calling it a climate action is not good enough. So as we think about where conservation can take place, we want to make sure that we're thinking about communities that have very little access to nature, and how we can undertake conservation in a way that allows and creates that access, but also is a place that will be perhaps refugia for plants and animals as temperatures change and sort of natural systems evolve under the impacts of climate change. And so the executive order called for a strategy for achieving 30 by 30. It was released on Earth Day. And so the work is underway, and we're really excited to drive on that goal in partnership with folks all across the state. The second strategy that was called for in the executive order is how can we make sure that our that the pillar of action, the sector of nature, is really truly integrated into California's climate portfolio. And so the request from the governor was pull together a strategy that's going to identify how we do this and what specific actions people need to take as they steward the lands that will have climate benefits. So this natural and working lands climate smart strategy really outlines what do we need to do, what are land management practices that can support achieving carbon neutrality and that can support building climate resilience. And so that strategy was also released on Earth Day. We're really excited about sort of setting this vision. It outlines the what do we need to do? The scoping plan, as I mentioned at the top, it sets targets. It says like, by this date, we will need to achieve, carbon neutrality by 2045. And that means each sector needs to do this much. And so for the first time, the natural and working lands sector has been really considered as an important element to achieving our climate goals. And we're going to be working, once the scoping plan is finalized, we'll be working to develop implementation pathways of, okay, we know what we need to do. We know how much of it is necessary, and it's a lot. And here's how we think we can get there. The climate smart land strategy is organized by landscape. So we're looking at deserts, we're looking at communities. You asked about how people can get involved. On 30 by 30, people are just central to the question of where to conserve, so that we're creating access. People are also central in the natural and working lands climate smart strategy to doing the work and to stewarding our lands for decades to come, but also in sort of our everyday life. And I want to just point out that a lot of there's a lot of sort of, oh, it's the forests, or oh, it's the oceans, but actually there's a lot of work that we can do in communities that will help deliver on nature's ability to support climate action. So whether it's green infrastructure investments, creating open space and parks, these are all opportunities to help drive on climate action. So I would just point out that the number of land management strategies that can deliver on climate in communities is greater than any other landscape types of forests or wetlands, et cetera. So a lot of work and a lot of opportunity for people.
Great, so exciting. And I think the plans, we feel pleased that the California Cultural Resources Climate Change Task Force were able to provide some information and get some infusion into these issues to help support the ambitions in both of those plans and all of the plans that you have mentioned. And that's really exciting. Yesterday, we heard from the governor's chief of staff, Ana Montesanto, and in our meetings, and she had mentioned, I think rightly so, in this really articulate way, that everything we do in climate change or any effort in the state really needs to be people-centered and help build capacity in communities, while still thinking about how we're going to continue to drive a good, healthy economic situation for California in the future. I'm wondering if you might talk a little bit to us about how the coordination at the agency level and the state works with the climate action plans, and how I've been so impressed by the amount of communication and integration to really move together on those. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that and where you see, I think it's so different and so robust. And I'm just wondering if you can talk about where you see those connective points and how you think that that's going to help us drive those to those goals better.
Absolutely. As I mentioned, the Newsom administration has really embraced sort of an all of government approach to address climate, and early on launched a climate cabinet, which essentially it consists of agency secretaries and other really critical leaders across state agencies and organizations to deliver California's approach to addressing climate change together. And this has been really an incredible effort. It was sort of pulled together early on in the process when we were developing our climate budget for the first time, and sort of realized, you know, the GGRF, which is the funds that California, it's a fund that builds capital from our cap and trade program. So this is a fund that's dedicated to funding climate solutions. It's not enough. So how are we going to expand the funding available for all of us to do the work that's important? You know, we can either fight over these scarce resources, or we can come together and press for more resources, and really sort of deliver the integrated approach that we know is necessary to really drive true, meaningful, credible action on climate change. And so this group meets regularly, as do all of their deputies. So that's a group that I serve on, and it's an incredible opportunity to coordinate with partners at BCSH or HHS, and to learn sort of where can we come together? What are you up to? How can we deliver on this work together? Because a lot of solutions are integrated in that way. So, partnering with our transportation agency to integrate nature-based solutions into some of their work, et cetera. There's a number of other sort of coordination functions, I would say, in developing these strategies. I'll just point to those two as, big, important efforts. CARB, really works with folks across all agencies. And I think in previous scoping plan iterations, they did a lot of the convening, but because there is so much work underway, they've essentially said, well, we'll just come to you. So, the group that's driving on the water resilience portfolio and how are we going to build water resilience in California, in the water sector, CARB is engaged with that existing group. Same thing for, wildfire. We have a wildfire task force. CARB is engaged with those folks to understand, their work and how it can be lifted up into the scoping plan effort. On the state adaptation strategy side, the Governor's Office of Planning and Research is required by statute to host a program that's designed to support local and regional climate adaptations alignment with state efforts on climate adaptation. And this group, this program has, in the last year or so, launched an interagency coordination group that helped to develop the state adaptation strategy. And the group consists of really critical climate actors and leaders across all agencies, and then a number of deputies like myself to help kind of refine and guide and make decisions that then get decided by all of our bosses. So there's a couple of different forums, but fundamentally I think the big picture is, you're right, there's an incredible amount of coordination, and we're going to have to keep that up as we really drive on implementation to get this done.
Thanks for that. I think it's so important, and I think the ethos that climate action is in every agency, every department, every action we do as state government. The same with for environmental justice, and I just think that when we're talking about these actions, they're no longer just single actions. They're integrated into so many different parts of the vision of a resilient California. And I think that that's going to make us get there faster to meet the urgency, and also putting us back in this COVID recovery time where we know that we're going through a lot of transition and changes in our society in general. Being considerate, conscious of all those different pieces being a component of all of our work every day, I think will get us there so much better, faster, and it'll be a more sustaining framework for people to take going forward. I think one last question, if you don't mind, can you talk give us a little bit, or give us an example of, but before I go, I'll say to the audience that we're going to post all the websites to access all of the different plans that Amanda talked about, and that'll be talked about during the day. So don't worry, we'll put it in there and you'll have the ability to have the references so that you can go look at these amazing plans and find ways to participate. Can you maybe talk to us about two final questions? Your role, the international connections. I know yesterday the governor signed an MOA on climate change with the Prime Minister of Canada. And I know we have other ambitions going on. And I think it's really helpful to understand how we're sort of in the middle of all of it as the seventh, fifth, however is counting, largest economy in the world. We're kind of a nation state and a state, but I really see us in that hub of the middle where we're helping to the very minute level in California and all of our communities, as well as targeting and working and learning from and sharing with global partners to accelerate our ambitions. And I'm just wondering if you can maybe talk a little bit about that international effort and maybe give us an example that you're working with on with a cohort or a particular MOA, and how that how you think that's going to help us learn to do better in the roles that we're trying to achieve.
Yeah, California has an incredible story to tell about international engagement. So, the global forum for addressing climate change is a United Nations convention called the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC, UNFCCC. And California has brought a delegation to those meetings for many, many years to show up and say, we're leading on reducing our emissions and building climate resilience, and demonstrating sort of year by year how we're able to reduce our emissions and grow our economy. I can't say enough about how important it is for California to continue to show up in that space, because what has happened over the course of the last 20 years is we've had federal governments that have been, really aggressive and ambitious on climate, and then those that have essentially said climate change isn't real, we don't need to take action in this space. So for our international partners who are negotiating with us and, increasing our ambition year by year, this is very difficult to truly build trust and confidence that the United States is going to be able to actually deliver and lead on climate in the long term. And what California has done is been that sort of trusted leader who is always there and sort of demonstrates what commitment to acting on climate looks like. In addition to, the importance of that as kind of pushing people along and helping the process. You're right, Julie, there's a lot of ways that California can help support other countries as they consider what actions they can take through sort of sharing lessons learned, providing some level of technical assistance, having sort of policy discussions. In addition, California can learn a lot from engaging with our international partners as well. So, as we think about how we're going to address catastrophic wildfire in California, how are other Mediterranean climate, either countries or subnationals, which is what we call sort of not federal level, but like states or regions, what are they doing, and how can we learn from one another so that we're not sort of reinventing the wheel all around the world, because we just don't have time for that. So there's really a lot of opportunity to learn and a lot of opportunity to share and help others along the way. I also work, I think you mentioned at the top that for the Resources Agency, I work to help support our international engagement as an agency. And I would just sort of point to the fact that, many of our MOUs, MOCs with other countries and other subnationals, we also signed an agreement with China. Again, I believe it was last month. These have for a long time, because these are often sort of what we are doing, we renew them, we identify new areas of cooperation. A lot of them have focused on emission reduction, on climate mitigation, and we're making a very concerted effort to build a lot more coordination and collaboration on the adaptation side as well. So really, it's incredible to see how California can show the way, but also learn from many others who are doing really interesting and innovative things where they live and where it might be appropriate here.
That's so great. And I think you're right. The need is so urgent. The timing is so here. We're not waiting for climate change anymore. We're experiencing it every day. I mean, I was having a conversation yesterday with my dad about how there's no tule fog in the Sacramento Valley anymore. Rarely there is. It's just that if we don't know it, we're still experiencing it in so many ways in our everyday life, maybe without realizing it. I wonder if you might just send us off with 3 thoughts about what people can do, where they can engage, and then just maybe give us a vision of what you see, where you see us in 3 years with the ambitions that we're doing.
3 things. Well, I think the first thing is to have hope. There is such a focus on addressing climate, not just in California, but across the country and around the world. So I think we can't move fast enough, but we are moving, and I have a lot of hope that the level of climate, the reality of what climate change looks like and what the crisis means for our lives and for our children's future is really spurring significant action. So I think that's the first thing, is to have hope. The second thing is to contribute. And so I think, whether that's through your work or through, how you live your life, your home, your commute, et cetera, to just think about ways that you can be driving on climate action. So, if you volunteer, could you volunteer for an organization that is doing this kind of work? Or if you're a procurement officer in for your company or your organization, how can you make sure that you're supporting companies that are taking climate action, or buying products that don't contribute to the problem, but rather contribute to the solution? So I think there's just many ways to get involved, and then to the extent that you're around children or have children or engage with youth, I think that would be my third recommendation, is to talk to young people, to work with young people, to consider their priorities for climate action, because we've heard a lot of, number one, there's just an incredible commitment to taking action. But number two, it's important, I think, to show that we're here for them and that we want to build the future that we know that they deserve, and to understand what their priorities are to the fullest extent possible, and let them know that we're here for them. We've heard a lot of anxiety in youth. And so I think that's a really important conversation to have. So what was the second part of your question, Julie? I was focused on the first one.
Oh, that was good. And then I just think, where do you see us in 3 years, 4 years? Let's say 4 years.
Thank you. Yes. Well, where I see us is being able to showcase, how these various strategies that I laid out have actually delivered benefits to people, to the planet, to our economy. So we're very focused on implementation and ensuring that that implementation is done in a way that people can understand and see and feel. And it is done in a way that, as I mentioned before, sort of, yes, we're addressing climate change, but these are actions that support economic growth, they support equity, and they support sort of broader environmental action. So I'd like to be able to say in 4 years, we're going to have invested a lot of funds and a lot of effort into what we can point to in a few years as very tangible results for people and the planet.
I agree. I think, your comment about the next 4 years being implementation, it's so important. I remember Earth Days when I was a kid, and then in university in the 80s, and there was a lot of conversation, but we're here, we're living it, and we need to, I think, really recognize, like you said, the hope, but also the implementation of these ambitions is really important. And I think what resounded to me in your answer was that we need to be doing these things so that people feel them, they see them, they can touch them. They're tangible. There are tangible connections to their everyday life where their kids play and where they go to work and where they recreate and how they spend their time. And I think that those connections and the conscious awareness of making sure that the public that we serve and who we're doing this for and whose input is helping guide these efforts in these directions really can see and feel it every day, the changes that will benefit, that are benefiting them and where they and their communities. And I think making those people-centered connections is really important. I want to just close by saying, Amanda, we are so happy that you came to us in 2019. We appreciate so much the work that the Natural Resources Agency, our friends at CaliPA and the other agencies and our governor are doing to really thoughtfully put plans and places together to meet this urgency by using science, involving communities, our tribes and their immense knowledge and contributions that they have. And mostly I think it's this collaborative, we're all rowing in this canoe together message that is not just a message or a soundbite, but it is truly the ethos of the work that everyone does every day. And just thank you so much for spending the time to chat with us today. And thanks for all you and everyone in agency does every day. We're just so happy to be part of this team. And I would just say to our audience, we'll give some websites. There's a lot of information. I think one of the most important things about our actions in climate change is that we can all do something, and there's plenty of time and places for you to connect with us. If there are ambitions or goals that you think that we're maybe need more attention, we're happy to take input, and there are ways to do that. But really look at those documents, see how you can engage, see how we can help you engage, and just we're all rowing towards this resilient future together. Thank you so much for your time today and for your words. We really, really are so happy that you were with us.
Thank you, Julie. And thanks to everyone again for being here. Look forward to listening in as to the fullest extent that I can.
That's great. Thanks so much. Chris and John, we're a little bit early. Shall we just roll into the next one, or what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think we could go ahead with Jesse's presentation.
Great. So we're going to move into the next part of our agenda. And this section is really to give the background. Amanda did an amazing job of giving us the sort of bigger picture, what's happening in climate change in California, how are we connected? The next session is really to talk a little bit more specifically about the Cultural Resources Climate Change Task Force, how it was created, who's involved, what we're doing. So Jesse and I are going to give a background and some information about that. Then we'll take a short break. And then after that, we're going to really just sort of dial down a little bit deeper and have some presentations from our partners who have both been involved intimately in the task force, but also are doing amazing things in their agencies. And I think it'll be really great for you to see how these thoughts and ideas have been translated on the ground, and how the definition of culture that we're using is much more expansive than just archaeology and the built environment, that we're looking at museums and collections, and incredibly important, our tribal communities, our tribal governments and partners, our adjacent communities, and how we hear the voices of people who have lived adjacent to sites for years, recreate, live, play, work on them. So we're really sort of going to go from the big, a little bit narrow, and then very specific. And then at the end, we're going to open it up and really just encourage all of you. Tell us what you're thinking. What did you hear? What would you like more information about? Share some examples that you'd like to have. And then this is hopefully the first of many different webinars that we're going to have listening sessions to really gain some input about the specific intersection of culture and climate change. So with that, we'll just get started. Jesse, do you want to put up our presentation? Great. So again, we're really excited to be here today, and thanks to the California Preservation Foundation for continuing to be such a strong partner with us in these conversations. it's such an important topic for all of us to raise the voices of culture in our communities, to make people inclusive and people-centric solutions in the face of climate change. I think we are at this moment in time, like there are these points in history, as many of you know better than I as historians, that really are big changes in societies and communities. And I think we're there with the sort of hopeful recovery of COVID-19 and how we're really beginning to get adjusted to what do we want our world to look like? What did we learn? What do we need to change? And how do we make every bit of our actions Jedi focused? I love that word. It always reminds me of Star Wars and lightsabers, but I think it just justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. How do we make sure that every one of our efforts allows people to come in, to share, to participate, and then to go back and implement? If we're not engaging our public, hearing what they want, listening to their needs, and finding ways to make our communities really, really resilient in ways that they believe are important, then I think as public agencies, we're not doing our job. But more importantly, I think without people's involvement, and we won't have the stewards to make these programs work in a long-term way. So partnerships and community are at the front and center of all the work that we're doing. As Amanda said, California leads by what can we do? What are we doing internally? But also by example and sharing. It's, this task force started under the auspices of Governor Jerry Brown, and the goals were twofold. How do we help ourselves, and how do we help others that maybe can't get there, or they're small economies, or for whatever reason, climate change isn't something that they have the time or the bandwidth, or the finances, the science to really do their communities justice. How do we help? I think that those are both really good goals to have. And so I state them at the beginning because you'll hear them integrated throughout our presentation and those of the partners that you'll see. And really interested in hearing how we do better always in those spaces. Next slide, Jesse.
Sorry, not sure why it's not going forward. Let me try. Oh, there we go.
There we go. So what's the why behind this task force? We need to create efforts to steward cultural heritage that align with all the state's initiatives. All these ambitions are going on. They were presently happening in these silos. And at some point, the idea, the notion, the realization that we're better together, and how do we work smarter, how do we work faster, and how do we combine resources, both financial and human capital, to really look at how we're holistically stewarding places that include culture, people, landscapes, environments, and communities. We needed a strategy for non-traditional ways to address cultural resources before they suffer the irreversible effects of climate change. I mean, as I mentioned before, we're using an expanded definition of cultural heritage to include artifacts, archaeological sites, cultural landscapes, tribal cultural resources, large holistic landscapes, the very important museums collections, in addition to buildings and structures. How do we capitalize? How do we use every aspect of culture to both make sure that those actions are that we're undertaking are influenced and culture aware? Are we better stewarding those resources that we have? And then how do we change our behavior? Culture is such a safe, known place for many people. It's a good way for us to have conversations and begin to understand as people what we need to be doing both to change our behavior and how we can help bolster and support the ambitions. The slide at the bottom is an example of at COP26 in Glasgow, there was a whole youth component and museum component. And this was an example of how museums could help support change in communities, all done by youth around the UK. So it was a really exciting example of how kids were thinking about how culture could help change behaviors and support communities in climate action. Next slide. So as you heard before, California has an ambition strategy and it used to be called Safeguarding California 20, and in 2018 was this big update that we were present and participatory in, and it details how California and state government takes action to respond to climate change. It describes overall strategies, and then it outlines ongoing cost-effective action. And remember, the goals are resilient economies, are to keep the natural working lands, to meet those carbon reduction goals, all to have a just, resilient climate future for all of us. Next slide, please, Jesse. So for the first time that we're aware of in a major policy document, cultural heritage was actually called out as a way, as an important and critical partner in our climate action efforts. We have there were specific tasks that were assigned to begin to look at, to begin to understand the intersection of cultural heritage and climate change. What does that mean? How do we do it? How do we add to existing frameworks that are going forward? What can we do now? And what do we need to change policy-wise in the future to embed and ensure that those climate strategies are people-centered and culture-focused, and that there's that component in there that we help the longevity of these holistic solutions. Next slide. So who are we? It's led by the Office of Historic Preservation, and you can see a sampling of the many and active state agencies that we had participating with us over the last couple of years, along with our partners in California Historical Society, California Humanities, and the California Museum. California, several years ago, started an informal cultural cabinet, similar to, it sounds like, the way that the climate cabinet has done. It's made up of the heads of the agencies of all the cultural departments and agencies, anybody working on culture, so state parks, the state library. And we started with that group and then added all the state agencies that had a role or might play a role in helping us infuse these ideas, thoughts, and ambitions. We met, and Jesse will talk about the path, about what the working of the group was following. Next slide. So at the same time that the Cultural Resources Climate Change Task Force was established, the Global Climate Action Summit came to San Francisco. It was led by Governor Brown and Mayor Bloomberg of New York at the time. It really brought the world to California to talk about culture, to talk about climate action, what was happening on a high level, what were some examples. It was not to the high involvement of COPs, of the convening of parties, but it was a major climate action summit. And for the first time, culture had a role in a session dedicated to this intersection as an official affiliated session. California Preservation Foundation was instrumental in helping us with this effort, as were local partners around California. The event was, as we said, dedicated to this conversation. What does it mean? What are we doing? What are the specifics? We had international and national scientists and traditional cultural practitioners. We had collections and museums. We had people from around the globe came together, both in person and virtually. I think we reached about 500 people globally as well, to talk about, what does it mean? What are we talking about? How do we get started? Where have we already started? I mean, it was a really major event that really kicked off this idea and this notion in a real way that tied it to global climate action. That whole convening was recorded. It's been broken down into individual speakers and also into sections, and its agenda and all of the recordings are on our climate action website. Again, we'll list at the end those links for people to get to. But I just can't emphasize the importance and the great fortune of, while we were figuring out how to get started, this Global Climate Action Summit timing was perfect, and it really did kick off both our internal task force, and then as you'll see later, was the incubator for a lot of other actions that we're involved in currently, and that we're driving to and greater increased ambition. Next, I'm going to turn it to Jessie, and she's going to talk about the workings of the task force over the last couple years. Jessie?
Thank you, Julie. So kind of going off of what Julie said, when the task force was kind of first born, there wasn't a real roadmap as to what we were, envisioned in doing. We had all these goals and actions that we wanted to accomplish, but we didn't know exactly, who the partners were going to be. So we reached out to all our state agencies and departments for participation, and through monthly meetings, we shared ideas on how the state can be better stewards to our culture and its heritage while exploring existing climate initiatives for greater climate ambitions. So this took a lot of work, and as many, we're still living it now 3 years later. The COVID-19 pandemic was a small setback, but it kind of proved to everybody that the work of our task force, was ever more important, and we moved forward. And I just, I'm so appreciative of everybody showing up, month after month, sharing ideas, what we can do, moving forward. And through these monthly meetings, we were able to capture the state's current climate initiatives, because not only, was this a call to action that we needed to do something now, but we didn't have any time to wait. So we needed to see what the state was already doing and try to figure out ways to embed culture in these initiatives that were already playing a big role in the state. So next. So while doing this, we used the ECOMOS report, The Future of Our Past. The ECOMOS report is the International Council on Monuments and Sites. We analyzed this report on how cultural heritage can be additive to existing projects, like I mentioned before, when we were meeting with our partners. The report really is, we analyzed the report to see how culture can play a role in helping with behavioral changes. I think Julie kind of touched upon that in her previous talk, in order to meet these climate ambitions. Within the report, we were looking at how are we going to, put these climate initiatives in a table. So we analyzed all of the climate, so we took all the state's climate initiatives, those that were captured, we put together a gap analysis. This gap analysis was comprised of all the climate initiatives from the state. So we took those and we used this table 6 framework to better see how a particular climate impact may affect particular aspects of cultural heritage. So as you can see, these top portions right here are 6 categories of cultural heritage. And then we had the rows were then describing the primary climate change impacts. So again, we took these climate impacts to see how they would affect particular aspects of cultural heritage. Is that going then back to Julie?
Yeah, thanks, Jessie. That's great. So the task force really we had these ambitions that we would get together, we'd have a conversation, we'd go out to the public and have some listening sessions, we'd somehow figure out what was happening in the state, and then COVID hit. And so while everybody was learning how to work remotely, how we were going to transition to keeping government moving, we had this task force and we had some timelines that we needed to meet. And I would say that the partners, while everybody was busy trying to just keep the status quo going, really dedicated themselves to participating, to being present. We had great participation during COVID. We soon realized that we had to sort of all get on the same conversation before we could even begin to talk about it. What did that mean? What were the definitions? And so we used that Futures of Our Past report that was just at this sort of, again, fortuitously released near the same time as we were beginning. We used it as a primer, and it really did help, and almost like a book club. And it really did help us all to understand definitions and thoughts and frameworks to then conduct that gap analysis in this really useful way. So the gap analysis has been created. We also, other efforts to date, at the same time, that Global Climate Action Summit effort, morphed into, incubated something called the Climate Heritage Network. We California co-chaired the Climate Heritage Network up until last year. It is a group of like-minded individuals around the globe, organizations, governments, practitioners who are working towards the same ambition of collaboration for an integration of cultural heritage into climate action, and then how just to help build capacity and stand up communities. So that was one outcome of the Global Climate Action Summit, and it runs parallel to the work we're doing on the task force. As I mentioned that California co-chaired the Climate Heritage Network, we also continue to be on the steering committee, and then we co-chaired one of the ambitions of the Climate Heritage Task Force that was in the lead up to COP26 in Glasgow last year, which is about carbon calculators for buildings. And Mark Huck of our office will talk about that effort in a minute. We partnered in several educational webinars. We raised the voices at COP26. The Climate Heritage Network was recognized and given official observer status at COP26. One of the first times and one of the biggest efforts of the United Nations to really raise the voices, bring people to the conversation, to understand and to get that whole holistic approach. And it's something that the United Nations has really recognized, that people, culture, all need to be involved in the solutions at the ground level to implementation. And so we've been participating in those efforts as well. We're co-leading an effort called the Race to Resilience, which there are 24 entities around the globe. The Climate Heritage Network and its culture-based efforts was selected to be one of them, to really infuse, embed, be a resource for cultural heritage in all of these conversations. And then our partners implemented projects that infused cultural heritage components in their existing works to create greater climate ambition. Again, we'll hear about those in a minute, but in a very short time and a very, very challenging time, I'm so proud of the work that we've all done together to really keep this conversation going, to understand how to do these integrations better for California, and then also to understand and learn so that we can bring more solutions to our state to meet this urgency. So next steps, I'll turn it over to Jessie and she'll walk us through what's ahead.
So what's next? Similar to today, our next steps, we aim to continue sharing the works of the task force and engaging the public and most importantly, tribes as well. We want to make sure to input the goals of the task force into what Amanda and Julie had already mentioned, into the California Adaptation Strategy, which was the replacement document to Safeguarding California 2018. And somewhat going back to kind of to what Amanda said, the strategy is organized around 6 outcome-based resilience priorities to building climate resilience. So here are the 6 different priorities, and what we needed to figure out was how the goals of the task force can be embedded into these 6 priorities. So we found that the goals of the task force fall under priority 1, which is strengthen protections for climate vulnerable communities, and priority 6, partner and collaborate to leverage resources. So then within these priorities, the strategy then has goals and these actions that Amanda had also mentioned. These actions are also correspond to the task force's goals. So the goals of the task force would then fall into action 7. We improve the understanding of climate change and its impacts on California's cultural heritage, including tribal nations. And then another goal, which is also an action, 17, incorporate cultural heritage in California's climate adaptation actions. And then last, we have action 6. We aim to increase protection of heritage and cultural resources from climate impacts through science-based tribal expertise and traditional ecological knowledge solutions in partnerships with California Native American tribes, adjacent communities, and the cultural and arts sector.
So we're really excited about those goals, and even though the cultural heritage ambitions in that document were in those 2 specific areas, it really does embed through all 6 of the sections, and we're working hand in hand with our partners through the Climate Heritage Network and other avenues in state government to help, to be a resource, to provide information, and to further advance the integration of cultural heritage into those to those other categories where there aren't specific tasks identified. We are creating a progress report, so we're detailing the findings to date of the work that we've done. We're highlighting the state agency projects, a few of whom we'll hear from in a minute. We're making recommendations for future actions, including possible policy changes to further advance the intersection of cultural heritage and climate action. So you might remember that the charge of the task force was to look at policy changes and create a cultural heritage climate change plan. We think at this moment it's important to just take a moment to understand where we are, get a read of what the actions are, the frameworks that are happening now in the state government that might have been different from 2018, and then really how does cultural heritage support those bigger ambitions, and what kinds of roles do we need to codify? Do we need to change barriers to entry for communities? What are the different types of things we need to do going forward to make those actions, those ambitions, those goals carry on, sustain through time to help the communities? We're going to continue with this gap analysis. We found that it's really helpful to understand and to continue to check in about what we're doing, look at our successes to measure progress, and also, really importantly, to provide a reference and sort of be an in-house consultant to our state agencies for questions, ideas, help them connect with other partners if they're looking for some specific ways to do that. And so we really felt that sort of internal customer service, if you will, somehow is going to be a really important component to going forward. And then, of course, and so importantly, to continue to work with partners within state government, external, local, regional, national, and global partners. We really see ourselves as sort of in the center of that hub, translating the international efforts to the state and local levels, to the community on the ground level, as well as taking all the voices, all the ideas, and all the thoughts that bubble up to us, and making sure that those voices are heard first person where possible, but to really make sure that ethos is embedded and the goals of stewarding cultural heritage to create a low carbon, just and resilient future for all of our communities is done every day. I think we're so happy to be in this canoe with all of you, and to be in it with all of our climate action partners at the state level. We're really excited about this unprecedented governmental integration that's happening across media and state government. And I think that really is the strength of California and our climate change efforts, is the connectivity, the one drive goal together, and how we're really working smarter and thinking more collaboratively to get these holistic solutions. Next slide, please. So there are some links that Amanda put in the chat. Thank you for that, Amanda, about some of the specifics that she discussed. Here are the links to the agencies that we talked about. Our office has a climate action tab. So if you go to our website, always on the very right-hand side, we will have the climate action tab. We post updates, webinar opportunities. The Global Climate Action Summit seminar is there. There's a link to the Climate Heritage Network and the work that they're doing. And then we also are linking to some of the state's ambitions. So it's a good reference point for you all if you want to know where things are. Our information is on there. Jesse's our project assistant for the climate change efforts. So you can always contact one of us with any questions. But we really just wanted to introduce you to what we were doing, how this is working at the state level. And then we'll take a little bit of a break, maybe for 10 minutes, just to give everybody a chance to stretch their legs, get some coffee, get your juices flowing. We're going to go into the really inspirational projects that our partners are doing. I'm excited to hear them. Every time I hear them, I learn something new, but mostly I'm just so proud of the work everybody's doing and so honored that we're able to partner with such thoughtful and smart people who are making differences both in their agencies and their communities on behalf of all of us. So we'll take a quick break, then we'll come back and have some shift it up a little bit to have some demonstrations, and then we'll open it up to what we hope to be a really robust conversation with all of you. Chris?
Yep, thank you so much, Julie. So I'm just going to show our slides for about 10 minutes and we'll see you all back here after our coffee break. Hello, that was my timer going off, Julie. I don't know if you heard that. Welcome back from the coffee break. All right, Julie, you take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, Chris. Welcome back, everyone. I hope you're back ready and rested. We're so excited to be going to this next session. Jesse Ochoa Diaz is going to be running the next section with our partners. We're, again, so super excited. And I also just wanted to take a moment. I didn't introduce Jesse and acknowledge that she is our staff lead for the climate work that we're doing. She came to our office right at the end of the Brown administration, and she really has kept it all together as she was learning the topics. And we're just really so pleased and proud to have her on our team, and I'm just grateful for the work that she's done and continues to do with us. So with that, Jesse, please take it away.
Thank you, Julian. I'm happy to be here. So I want to introduce our 4 speakers that will be sharing some of their work that they've been working on. Let's see, we'll have Jennifer Maddox. She's a science policy advisor and tribal liaison for State Lands Commission. We have Len Nielsen, he's staff chief and tribal liaison for CAL FIRE. We have Kathleen Kennedy, she's a state historian too at the California State Parks, and Mark Huck, restoration architect for the Office of Historic Preservation. So I'll go ahead and let Jennifer present. Jennifer, whenever you are ready, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you, Jesse. Can I get a check on whether I shared successfully?
We can see your screen.
Great. Well, thank you very much. As Jesse said, my name is Jennifer Maddox. I'm the science advisor and tribal liaison at the California State Lands Commission. And of course, because I can never do anything the easy way, this morning's dialogue made me completely rethink my sort of practiced talking points and kind of want to flip it upside down a little bit. So I'm going to leave it on this introduction slide just for a quick second, because I wanted to kind of first provide a through line with what was just being talked about before, about how participation in this task force is really about like utilizing and leveraging the resources that we already have and the programs that we're already implementing to consider culture and in our existing programs, and in particular climate change programs or land management programs. And so I wanted to make sure I jotted down a little bit about the through line here. I don't know how many people are familiar with the Owens Dry Lake. It's located in Inyo County, and I'll talk a little bit about its history in terms of our management jurisdiction. But before I do that, I'll just link back to the ECOMOS and the cultural heritage categories and the historical use of the Owens Lake, which to the Paiute and Shoshone people who've lived there since time immemorial was known as Patsiata. We've got some history, scientific history going back about 14,000 years, and the historic shoreline fluctuated wildly. And there was a pattern by the indigenous communities to move with the changing shorelines and various drought conditions, which means there's a lot to be learned, both for tangible and intangible heritage, the resilience, the adaptation, and I'll talk a little bit more later on about traditional ecological knowledges and practices. So here we have cultural heritage categories of archaeological resources, intangible cultural heritage, cultural landscapes, and many more. And then the interface with climate change being increased temperatures, changing freeze and thaw cycles, increased winds and changes in wind patterns, drought, and aridification. So I just wanted to set that stage, keep that in mind as I take you through just a few slides about the history of Patsiata, or the Owens Lake. And first, I'll just let you know a little bit about who the State Lands is and why we are a part of this. So just to set the stage, we're a land and resource manager. We administer public trust lands These are also known as sovereign lands. I try to stay away a little bit from that term, although it is a sort of a term of art, because we don't want to confuse with sort of tribal sovereignty. So we administer about 4 million acres of the state's tide and submerged lands. So the entire coastline out to the 3 nautical mile boundary, and then about 120 rivers and sloughs and about 40 lakes, including Owens Lake. We also have some surface owned lands that we manage for the benefit of the teachers' retirement system. But today we'll be focusing on these public trust lands, including Owens Lake. So why are they called public trust lands? Well, we get our authority via the common law public trust doctrine, which is founded in ancient Roman law and more recently in English common law. And so our pillars that we manage is the public's right to use public waterways for commerce, navigation, fishing, recreation, open space, other water-oriented activities. And these sort of our policies in administering our lands are found in our strategic plan, our environmental justice policy, and our tribal consultation policy, where we've really tried to create that link between our duties under the public trust and cultural preservation and uplifting of tribal governments and tribal self-determination as a valuable public trust ethic. So really quickly, here's a couple of photos of the photos/drawings of historical Owens Lake. The lower picture is Cerro Gordo, and you can see the lake in the background. There was a steamship. This lake was 110 square miles. It was 50 feet deep in places. And it's, as I mentioned, been used for thousands and thousands of years by the tribal communities of the area before they were forced off through forced marches. There was massacres. It was a really, really terrible colonial invasion of this area and real dispossession of the tribal communities of this area. So as most people, as most people know, the city of Los Angeles in the early part of the 20th century created the Los Angeles Aqueduct and proceeded to divert water from the Owens River to service the burgeoning population of Los Angeles. That caused the lake to almost completely dry up by 1930. Which resulted in terrible dust storms. And so the little photo or the illustration on the far side, that's what the lake looks like today. And I'll explain a little bit about why it looks like that. So here's a couple of additional pictures of sort of current Owens Lake. And the way that it looks today is because the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency through its local air board, the Great Basin Unified Air Pollution Control District, ordered the city of Los Angeles to control dust. This lake was, when it was dry, was the largest global emitter of PM10 emissions globally. Because it's a saline lake and there is a sort of a salt crust, it just created this horrible mix of conditions to create dust storms. And so the city of Los Angeles was ordered to control dust using a highly engineered system of pipes and sprinklers, gravel cover, managed vegetation, and shallow flooding. And so you can see here some shorebirds using one of the ponds that's created to suppress dust. We've got a problem here on the lake with climate change. So we've had a series of events, both to the extreme drought and to the extreme wet. The drought conditions are making it increasingly difficult for the city of Los Angeles to want to put water on the lake, and they are saying that they need to have that water to deliver to customers. So there's sort of a new imagining of lake management that needs to be addressed by a cohort of us We have, as I mentioned, rising temperatures, increased aridification. Is becoming more difficult to manage the vegetation, and there's an increasing interest in dust solutions that use less or no water. The tension that creates is that re-engineering the lake bed not only disturbs cultural resources, but also threatens the lake's sort of Western Hemisphere and global importance as waterfowl and shorebird safe havens. So we want to talk a little bit about what we're doing to find solutions to this tension. So I just wanted to show a little bit about sort of who is working on these things and how we are a group that is collaborative, all working towards what we hope to be common solutions that preserve heritage, but that also protects public health, and that meets the objectives of the city of Los Angeles, who does own the water rights in this area. So as I mentioned, we do want to protect cultural resources. We also want to conserve water, reduce the public health hazard. So what we're doing is looking to leverage some traditional cultural practices and to highlight the use of traditional knowledges and management. We've had a vegetation enhancement project has been proposed, and there has been some cultural burning. I remember there was a little, I think that we're going to hear a little bit more about cultural burning practices and how that can help us find ways that to manage land that is a little bit better balance and more reciprocity with the land. So I'll just lastly speak to a few of the projects that we've worked collaboratively on with, again, many state and federal partners, local governments, local communities, and tribal governments. You'll see here sort of a recreation and trail project that was designed, again, with everybody's input. The last thing I'll mention to wrap it up and bring it back home is the recent action by the State Historical Resources Commission to list the Patsiata on the state register and also send the nomination to the national register. This is a really important and official recognition of the scientific and cultural importance of the lake. And we really feel that there's a lot to be learned from the way that the indigenous people really lived in reciprocity as the lake over the climatic changes of the past 14 to 15,000 years, managed to live in reciprocity. And so what can we learn now? How can we learn how to find solutions where you're finding the best balance rather than just thinking only about one thing? So this listing is very important, and it's a great step along the way of sort of creating that collaborative atmosphere and recognizing the importance of the both physical and intangible culture of Owens Dry Lake, also known as Patsiata. And that is the conclusion of my presentation and case study. Thank you. I'll stop sharing now, Jesse.
That's great, Jennifer. Thanks. We may have lost Jesse. So I'll just keep going. Next, we have Len Nielsen with CAL FIRE. Len, if you're ready, please take it away.
I think so. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. And hopefully I'm sharing the appropriate slide. Let me know when that's up.
Yeah, it looks
You see
good.
your screen. Maybe you can put it in presentation mode. Perfect.
Okay, there we go. Well, thank you for having me. I really appreciate being here today. My name is Len Nielsen. I am the staff chief for prescribed fire and vegetation management within CAL FIRE, and part of my duties include being a cultural tribal liaison for the department. And in that role, in charge of cultural resources for the department, I've been trying to do more cultural burning awareness trainings for the last 6 months or so, although it's taken about a year to really get going. So I'm going to talk about that today a little bit, about how cultural burning, how CAL FIRE is doing cultural burning, or at least sharing some cultural burning awareness training with other state employees, not just with CAL FIRE. So to start off, what does cultural burning mean? And for a lot of people, it really means revitalization of the land. It means bringing back the resources that Native people to revitalize the culture. It's all about this rebirth of what's there now. It brings back basket material, medicines, the practice of caring for the land. And that social aspect of caring for the land really runs deep within tribes. I see that firsthand with the folks that I work with within cultural burning and tribal resources, to see how much they care for the land, and their traditional ecological knowledge really shines through. And so using fire to revitalize, the century plus of suppression of fire and suppression of using cultural burning, it really has taken a toll on California, across California's landscape. And so working with partners, with tribes, it's starting to get a new revitalization and a new awareness for California to use and to work with tribes across California. And so it's quite exciting. So to date, I've been able to work with several tribes in California to have 3 cultural burning awareness trainings or seminars or experiences. It's about that experience. It's about sharing that knowledge. The first one was January 17th of this year. All of this happened this year. January 17th in Mariposa. It was hosted by the North Fork Mono Tribe and the Southern Sierra Miwok Nation. And the Honorable Ron Good, chairperson of North Fork Mono, led the training. And with that training, we concentrated on actually doing some burning on the site, which is a beautiful Native American site that has a ton of archaeological cultural resources present currently, and it has been managed and maintained for 50 or 60 years for tribal resources. And so it's a site that has had cultural burning on it for years without any state influence whatsoever. And so the relationship that I have with Ron Good, he's allowed me to learn from him and to gain that cultural awareness and the importance of it by being around him and joining him in his effort in teaching, but I've been the student, cultural awareness. And so we were at an event together that he was putting on, and I said, hey, what about teaching this to state employees? And he said, sure. And so then we thought about it some more and said, okay, let's put a date on and let's do the logistics. And we got it all together. And January 17th, we went out there for a full day with about 50 state employees and did some burning, some pile burning of some sourberry and some redbud. And he was able to teach with some friends of his and some other cultural presenters, and to teach about what cultural burning is. We did the same or similar thing on March 8th in Woodland, hosted at the Cache Creek Nature Preserve, with the Maidu, Wintu, Hupa, and Yurok tribal presenters. And the main one there was Diana Milderez of the Maidu, Wintu Nation. And she did a phenomenal job teaching us about 50 or 60 people, state employees mostly, from Park and Recreation, from CAL FIRE, from Department of Conservation. Several different agencies attended that. And with that, again, we were, the students of cultural resources and the connection of cultural resources to fire. And so at that one, we were able to burn about 5 acres of tules within a wetland area of the Cache Creek Nature Preserve while we were there. And later on, a few weeks later, we actually went back with a small group of CAL FIRE and some folks from the Nature Preserve, and we burned another 14 acres in order to revitalize that Thule area for, really gaining a better resource source of material for tribal needs and cultural purposes. So it was very successful, walking away from there, gaining that knowledge. And then just this week, on June 7th, we went up to Orleans and again had a full capacity group of about 40 people, and it was hosted by the Karuk tribe up there. With a special thank you, of course, to Bill Tripp, Kathy McCovey, Frank Lake, and Margaret Robbins of the Yurok and Karuk tribes. They were phenomenal presenters and really set it up with a lot of presentations in the beginning of the day. And then we went out to the field and we viewed areas that have had some prescribed fires on, where cultural resources are present and are being revitalized. We actually looked at an area that had a kind of a hot prescribed fire that occurred nearby, near an orchard of oak trees, of legacy oak trees. And then immediately next door to that, there was a lower intensity fire, prescribed fire that occurred in another part of that same orchard of oak trees. And it was just amazing to see the differences and the understandings that occur and the connections that occur with cultural burning. And so it was very informative, and it was a great experience for me personally. And so far I've heard nothing but positive responses, and I'm hoping to do another one as soon as fire season is over, as we ramp into fire season here with CAL FIRE, in the future, in the fall, and possibly, hopefully, I have my fingers crossed that I'll get to work with Don Hankins from Chico and be able to do something in that neighborhood. So what, with cultural burning, what's the takeaway, right? Well, the takeaway for cultural burning is really about a relationship that you have with the cultural burners. And so for the state of California, with SB 332 and recent legislation, it's really opened up the opportunity for cultural burners to burn more. There's less liability. If they're, under SB 332, from gross negligence or from simple negligence to gross negligence, it's the fire escapes, which is huge, right? Fire suppression has occurred in California for about 120 years. Been really good at it. But the problem is California is fire adapted, and it needs fire across the landscape. And cultural burners knew that in millennia. And so for millennia. So they knew that. They took care of the land. And by having fire suppression, by having being so good at it, it's really compacted the issue. And now it's time to really encourage and to support cultural burning. Even though, CAL FIRE is really set up for suppression of fire, it's about prescribed fire. And with prescribed fire comes different aspects like managed fire, the true prescribed fire, and cultural burning. Cultural burning is different, very different than just the normal prescribed fire aspect. Prescribed fire in California is really defined as the intentional use of ignition of fuels for fuel reduction. That's it, fuel reduction. That's like the main purpose of prescribed fire. Cultural burning, on the other hand, is really about that connection to the who, what, when, where, and why of the fire, of the burning. And so, it's about timing. It's about what that means for the resources that are there, for the resources that it revitalizes, and for the culture that it supports. And so cultural burning is more about the culture than it is about the burn. But the burn and when they're burning, where they're burning, what they're burning is all connected. And that's very different than just the standard fire suppression school of thought that I came from, which was we're burning in order to reduce the fuels. And so the cultural burning awareness class really teaches you that awareness of the connections of the cultural burning. And CAL FIRE is here to help. We're here to build that relationship because it really is about a relationship between an agency, whether it's CAL FIRE, state parks, Department of Conservation, Office of Historic Preservation, whomever, about that relationship they have with the tribal leaders and the cultural burners in order to promote and support cultural burning. We can provide technical assistance at CAL FIRE. We can provide some resources from CAL FIRE. But all prescribed fires and cultural burning, they all require an opportunity for that to happen under the right conditions. And so we really encourage to be ready. And we try to be ready in CAL FIRE at all times for all risk, but we also try to be ready to support cultural burning. And so we are moving more in that direction. And these cultural burning awareness classes that I've been organizing are evidence of that. In the last one, we were able to invite our director, Joe Tyler, our assistant deputy director, or our deputy director, Chris Anthony, our assistant deputy director, Matthew Reichman, and our Northern Region Chief, which is George Morris III, and the unit chief, Kurt McCrae, all attended the cultural burning awareness class on June 7th. And so having our leadership there to gain that awareness, I think is pivotable for, or will pivot us in the direction to support cultural burning. And then last but not least, I just want to end with a great quote I heard many years ago: knowledge is only gained when it's shared. And that's it.
Great, thank you, Len. And I also want to remind folks to use the Q&A part of the Zoom to submit any questions that you may have for our panelists at the end of everyone's presentations. So up next, we have Kathleen.
Hello, let me just see if I can get this going. All right, before I get started, I just wanted to say that I attended the march, the cultural burning, and it was an incredible day. The generosity of the tribes, the hosts, and CAL FIRE was just really amazing. Learned so much. But today I'm going to be talking about boxes of boxes. The California Statewide Heritage Disaster Recovery Project provides packing materials for collections that museums, archives, libraries, and other cultural institutions can access to evacuate culturally significant objects during an emergency. These collections include art, archaeology, baskets, furnishings, textiles, books, records, and other fragile objects. Unfortunately, we're all too aware of the escalating fire danger. With climate change and the related drought, the number of communities impacted by wildfire is ever increasing. As a result, the California State Library, California State Archives, and California State Parks proposed a project that resulted in the establishment of 6 caches of packing supplies for emergency evacuations. Federal grant funding provided for the establishment of the 6 caches. If additional funding is secured, that the project will be expanded to include training and additional sites. Prior to the development of the caches, California State Parks had plenty of experience evacuating the state park museums and sites. There are 279 California State Park units with the largest and most diverse recreational, natural, and cultural holdings of any state agency in the nation. State Parks features house museums, fine art collections, archaeological artifacts, historic furnishings, wagons, items both unique and of everyday use. 7 major fires burned across the state in the 3 years leading up to the development of this emergency response project. During the earlier events, we would fill moving trucks with supplies in Sacramento out of our main headquarters. And it took a lot precious time to get to the parks that were endangered from the fires. I recall in 2017 during the Sonoma Napa fire, being on the phone with the head curator at Sonoma Historic Park, asking where we were because ash was falling on them and they were expecting us to roll up at any minute to help remove those collections. Instead, we were still in Sacramento, trying to get the supplies in the trucks and enough trucks to evacuate the collections. Today, heritage institutions such as those listed here have access to the caches. Artifacts can be carefully and appropriately packaged for transport and storage until they can be returned after the danger has passed. The caches are 6 climate-controlled and secured connexes filled with shelving to hold boxes, paper, wrap, tape, and all the tools necessary for the evacuation of delicate and irreplaceable cultural resources. The materials stored in the connexes meet curatorial standards with archival quality boxes and packing paper. Here you see the interior of the connex being loaded. When an institution draws from these supplies, they're expected to replenish them, the stock for the next event afterwards. The connexes are managed and maintained by state parks. Here you see photos of the evacuation from the Getty fire. The cache was accessed for supplies, artifacts, art, and books were carefully packaged and removed to safety. This work is accomplished by trained staff and volunteers. Packing cultural objects takes great care to avoid damage, from the delicate finishes that have to be protected, support to avoid stress cracks or tears. Some objects require unique boxes to be made and enough filler to absorb any road vibrations in the transportation. A successful evacuation really takes planning, time, and teamwork. Prior to an emergency, institutions should establish an emergency response plan that includes identifying the objects to be evacuated, train staff and volunteers in appropriate packing techniques, as well as identifying where collections can be safely removed to. Additionally, if the plan includes accessing one of the 6 caches, you should identify where the closest cache is and connect with the district staff prior to any emergencies. On this map, the location of the caches are represented as yellow dots, with the smaller orange dots representing museums, and green dots are facilities. You can see that well enough, such as, and then there's also blue dots that are the state parks, museums, and visitor centers. Each of the caches needed to be located in places that featured both electricity and security. So they're located in the administration areas of state parks that include Chaussee Indian Grinding Rock State Historic Park, Lake Paris State Recreational Area, Malibu Creek State Park, Shasta State Historic Park, and finally Sugar Pine Point State Park. Here you can see the caches again, with the driving time within 1 hour represented with the dark purple, and then within 2 hours, the lighter purple. We hope through this project that we will minimize the damage and loss of precious cultural objects during emergency events that not only include wildfire, but also earthquakes, flooding, and extended loss of electricity. And that's all I have. Thank you. Let's see.
Thank you, Kathleen. So next we have Mark.
Hello, thank you, Jesse. I'm Mark Huck. I'm a restoration architect at the Office of Historic Preservation. And today we are going to talk about the CARE tool, the Carbon Avoided Retrofit Estimator. It's a tool that quantifies the difference between the embodied carbon in an existing building that's been operated for 15 years, a renovated building that's been operated for 15 years, and a brand new building that has been operating for 15 years. The tool was developed by Lori Ferris, Larry Strain, and Aaron McDade. It's a project of Architecture 2030, which is a nonprofit organization dedicated to transformation of the building sector from an emitter of greenhouse gases to a net zero emission industry. It's promoted by climate and heritage supporters to use by professionals as a design tool for reducing carbon, policymakers as a means to mandate carbon reduction, and industry to innovate products and materials geared toward rehabilitation. What is embodied energy as opposed to operational carbon? Operational carbon is the quantity of carbon emitted during the occupied life of a building once constructed, as represented on the graph in yellow. We're familiar with the reduction of this form of carbon as energy efficiency, which has been the historical focus of carbon reduction efforts by the building industry. Embodied carbon is the carbon emitted during the material procurement, manufacturing, transport to site, construction, and demolition of the physical building itself. The combination of embodied carbon and operational carbon together are known as the life cycle of the building, or colloquially cradle to grave. And you see here pictured the life cycle of the physical building in blue.
Mark, we don't see your slides.
Because I have to share my screen. Can you see my slides?
Yes, we see them now.
Okay, I'm sorry about that. Okay, this is the slide that demonstrates the building life cycle. The embodied carbon is represented in blue and operational carbon in yellow. And you can see represented here that over the lifetime of a building, you have this much operational carbon emissions, but there's much embodied carbon in the beginning when the building is built, through maintenance repair, and then to tear the building down. So that is all together represented as the life cycle of the carbon of the building. The fraction of embodied energy in the total life cycle of a building is estimated to be about 28% on average. So in the course of the life cycle of the building, that's the representation of the total carbon. Now, operational carbon is a lot of it, but there's still a lot represented in the building of it, and we are building all the time. The contribution of greenhouse gases by the building sector as a percent of all greenhouse gas emissions is close to half of the total of total carbon emissions as represented by the graph. This half would be the building sector. And some estimates really put it closer to about 40%, but it's a large chunk of our economy. At any one time, the number of operational existing buildings is much greater than the operation of new buildings coming online. One conclusion that can be reasonably drawn from these statistics is that building reuse resulting in less new construction reduces overall carbon emissions. It has been demonstrated from several studies that reuse and retrofit of an existing building can result in reduced embodied carbon emissions of 70 to 85% compared to new construction. This difference of carbon emitted between a new versus reused building is known as the reduced impact. The CARE tool was developed to specifically highlight the difference in carbon life cycle emissions between the new building, a comparatively retrofitted existing building, and the same existing building continuously operated, as represented by the graph. These quantities can guide developers and professionals whether to retrofit or build new, or provide jurisdictions information needed to make or enforce policies to reduce their carbon footprint. And this is how it works. There's an Excel dashboard with drop-down menus over here, and there is a menu of renovation and upgrade options. So you would select the appropriate upgrades or renovations that are being planned. There are 4 new building options to model the carbon output of a comparable building, a comparable new building. And then options for operational efficiency below to refine these estimates, and embodied carbon modifiers that also help to refine the model. So it produces 2 models, 3 models really. You model the existing building here, just operating for 15 years inefficiently to get 1,705 tons of carbon. You have the new building with its represented embodied carbon and its efficient use of operating energy over 15 years, which is 1,048 tons. And then you have the rehabilitated building with the cost of the embodied rehabilitation costs in blue and its operational energy over 15 years, which is a total of 692 tons. So in this case, the model clearly shows that the renovated option is the best option from a emitted carbon point of view. The CARE tool is valuable in demonstrating carbon reduction towards required goals, regulating products, or writing building codes, setting institutional development limitations for real estate management. As a case study for CARE, this Boston University library was retrofitted from an existing building. Their analysis demonstrated that over a 15-year period, total carbon emissions would be 1,700 tons. Here, new building would be 1,048 tons, and the retrofit would be 692 tons. So that was the model graph that was on the previous page. So the tool is valuable in demonstrating carbon reduction towards required goals, regulating products, or writing building codes, and setting institutional development limitations for real estate management, providing incentives for private development, and just leading by example. So here in the slide, we have government. Government can use this tool to create estimates of emitted carbon for use in multilateral commitments, such as the Paris Agreement. Can be used to create policy nationally. States and cities can also use it to create and enforce policy. Institutions can use it to guide their development strategies, investment and incentives. The tool can be used to set limits for grants and tax credits. It's a tool for professionals, and it's a good education and training tool. And for regulations and codes, these quantities can be used to measure the benefits of building codes and can guide product development. So it's a new tool. So the next steps are being taken by Architecture 2030, which has adopted this. And it's a much needed tool for the building sector, policymakers, and design professionals. Its utility is planned to be expanded for use around the world by acquiring additional regional energy use data, vernacular building and construction values, and available retrofit actions. For more information on the CARE tool, you can visit the Architecture 2030 website. So to conclude, rehabilitation design professionals have the experience, training, and tools to respond to the current climate crisis. Historic buildings especially, built before the availability of mechanical environmental controls with passive techniques to keep occupants comfortable using little energy, provide ideal examples of how to realize reduced carbon emissions for future development. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. So now we'll open it up for questions if there are any.
And could I also ask all the presenters to turn on your cameras so we can have you as part of our panel? Jennifer, Kathleen, thanks so much. Let's see, do we have any questions in the chat? Jonathan, are you seeing any?
No questions yet, but I'll keep an eye out.
Great. Well, I've got some questions then maybe while we're getting going. Jennifer, I'm wondering if you can give us some examples, excuse me, of climate-related risk impacts that you have been responding to on the lake that perhaps threaten culture. And then also, if you can speak to us about just any other efforts that the State Lands Commission is looking at in the intersection of cultural heritage and climate change, or where you see the understanding of having that tool really helpful to the work that you do every day.
Thanks, Julie. I really appreciate the question because, that was in the case study, one of the, that's these examples of what we're dealing with in real time, sometimes on a very compressed time frame. That's where we fall back on the relationships that we've built among all of the parties that work on the Owens Lake and have that established built-in sort of collaboration. So what we're generally seeing is drought and sort of a lack of water. So there's a lot of pressure on the city of LA to increase or to put as much water into the aqueduct to go to the residents and ratepayers of LA as possible, and are looking for solutions that use less water on the lake. And so part of what we're doing is exploring sort of experimental or hybrid approaches where we are maintaining the habitat value for the important wildlife species, but also allowing sort of the necessary delivery of water. And so those are things that we're trying to do in that are less engineering intensive, because that's the key for culture, right? Anytime you're grading or laser leveling or building levees and berms, you're moving dirt around, that's where a lot of sort of the physical artifacts are being disturbed or destroyed. So we're also looking at potential opportunities to go completely away from sort of the three that we call the gravel, water, or managed vegetation, and look to try to improve the growth of natural vegetation that's on the playa, rather than these sort of more, I would call them like agricultural looking plugs, engineered plugs of vegetation. So we're calling on the traditional cultural resource management to say, what plants do you see that are here that we can help them thrive by maybe giving some extra water or things like that. We've had this, again, a cultural burn that was looking to kind of take out some of the water hogging shrubs and allow the meadow near the seeps and springs to really thrive. So things that don't really dig in and disturb the soil and destroy artifacts and really make it look ugly, those are things. But then the opposite end, we had an incident in 2017 where we had a huge snowpack year. And then a warm spring. And so all this snow melt happened at once. And there was this like really intense effort to do some emergency diversion measures. They had big sort of blow up cofferdams and worked on the pump back station, because if there was floodwaters that came down, that could destroy, hundreds of millions of dollars worth of infrastructure on the lake, and that doesn't, that also doesn't help anybody. So those are the examples I would use there. And then just more generally with the State Lands Commission, I would harken back again to a couple of documents that we've recently completed. Everybody's got a tribal consultation policy, including us. But where our commission really started looking forward to that intersection of climate change, equity, and tribal self-determination is via the 2021 to 2025 strategic plan, as well as the environmental justice policy. So we actually are going out and seeking proactively input from tribal governments for access agreements, co-management agreements, and really kind of seeking that really foundational knowledge to help us, because we view ourselves as a land and resource manager looking to the tribes who are land and resource managers before we ever got here. So we just feel like we have a lot to learn. And so we build that into our equity and climate program measures.
That's great. It's super exciting, and really appreciate that you're thinking about all of these things as you're going forward with your everyday work, and really helpful in the what do we need to change as we're working collaboratively in the task force. I wonder, Kathleen, if you might talk to us about what State Park sees ahead for this effort and this collaboration. I know you also talked about emergency plans for collections and museums, and I wonder if you can talk a little bit too about that portion of the work that you are all doing to support those efforts.
Well, our division, the Cultural Resources Division of State Parks, has really worked with our our different districts to help them develop their wildfire emergency plans that include that strategies of how to protect the collections and the resources. So plans for evacuation are being developed. We've had some interesting tools of learning that when you do evacuate things, taking photos and having maps of where the key collections that you want to remove, where they're located at, to make sure that they're gathered in an emergency, because you don't always have, but when there's a wildfire specifically, but when there's an emergency, the staff at the location are usually impacted at the personal level. So a lot of times the people who you would naturally expect to be there to conduct an emergency evacuation might not be available because they could be taking care of their own homes and families and things. And so our division acts as a backup. Throughout the state, we have trained staff that go and help out to provide that support so that people can take care of their own needs as well. And those are within state parks. But there are examples that can be, you can contact our SMCC, our statewide museum collection center, if you have an institution that would like more information about evacuation plans or different strategies. They definitely would be willing to lend a hand and have a discussion. So.
Thank you so much. That's really great. And I think what I love about these examples is that it seems like it's not the big sexy things that are going to get on the news, but they're so important, and they're so important to saving and preserving these collections, understanding where people can take things if they need to remove them so they'll be safe where they're going. I mean, it's all the things that we don't think about because we don't manage these really precious resources every day. But I I find these programs at the same time, not like, why didn't we think of this before? But they're so important, and the importance of them just is so so huge, I think. And so I really appreciate that State Parks with other partners is taking the lead on trying to think about how to protect and retain these collections. I wonder, Len, if you might share with us, I know that you mentioned that these are prescribed burns with tribes, and it's different to sort of firefighting, but I wonder if you can tell us if there's any connection that you and CAL FIRE see in these things, and how has it helped you how has it helped you, how has it helped CAL FIRE with the other parts of your duties and responsibilities, this information and this knowledge and partnership?
Well, I'll start with the first part of that, which is, prescribed fire. So prescribed fire historically, practitioners of prescribed fire within CAL FIRE and U.S. Forest Service and other agencies really stems from the effort and fuel reduction from one vegetation type to another, right? And the objectives may be habitat improvement, it may be, for forage, it may be just pure fuel reduction and maintenance. So then, catastrophic fire has less of a chance to get going, right? And so that's like the normal point of view or perception of prescribed fire. And then when you talk about cultural fire, you really talk about how the connections of that cultural burn, what it's connected to. And so one example that I heard recently was about the bumblebee, and how the bumblebee will fly on the manzanita flowers, and how when you see the queen bumblebee on the manzanita flowers that it's just about time to burn, because the bumblebee will nest down into the ground and be safe from a cultural burn. And so in order to protect the pollinators, the bumblebee, then you wait for that cultural burn to occur, because the resources that they're protecting are the bumblebee and the resources that are provided from the bumblebee to the tribe. And so it's little connections like that are brought up during the cultural awareness class that from a fire practitioner standpoint are, we just don't look at it like that. And we don't look at the other connections that like almost web of life that's part of the cultural burning versus the point of view that as normal practitioners, we look at the point of view of how can we safely burn this vegetation in order to reduce the hazard. That's like a very focused goal. Now, there are other co-benefits that occur when we do that, but I would say from the cultural burning aspect, I see that there's a much deeper connection to the burn, and the connection really revitalizes the culture, because it was a day-to-day thing that occurred in the millennia, right? But before. So we're looking at it from, as a practitioner for prescribed fire, we look at it as how can we change this right now for the next 3 to 5 years. And cultural burning is about continued maintenance of the landscape, not just for the next 3 to 5 years, but for the next millennia. And so it's a very different approach. It's very focused on the connections across the culture, and just the traditional prescribed fire from a suppression protection standpoint is very different. And what was the other part of your question?
How do you see that informing or influencing the other work that CAL FIRE does? Like, I can imagine, but I'd be happy to understand like how that sort of that idea that the things that you're learning in these really permeate or help you think about the rest of your job in different ways.
So I would say the biggest impact that I see it occurring across the department is to really enforce the importance of relationships, the importance of that relationship to that cultural burner, for the tribe, for the area, for the community. That's really, I see that focus and that shift from for us to really focus on the importance of that. It's not, now that importance has always been there, but with new legislation, it's going to allow additional cultural burning to occur. And CAL FIRE is in a position to be able to assist and to help with that, not necessarily lead it, because as a cultural burner, they have their tribal ecological knowledge already in place. And so we're there to help and assist, and that's been our position. And so we hope that being in that position, we can increase that pace and scale for cultural burning because we want to increase the pace and scale of prescribed fire. And under the California Strategic Plan for Beneficial Use, we've identified those as two different things: prescribed fire and cultural burning, and of course managed fire for the third. And all of that make up the beneficial fire definition. And so we're looking at increasing all of those, and cultural burning is one major aspect of that.
That's so great. And I think what you touched upon is the importance of partnership, but I feel like it's more than that. I think it's power sharing, partnerships, respect for knowledge and science and their collaborative benefits rather than one or the other. And I think that in everything we're doing in the task force, your talk reminded me that it really is about making sure that all voices are at the table, that everybody that is there has something to contribute. Everybody has something to contribute, and every voice is valuable. And working together with that many voices, nobody loses their own individual authority, but together we're better in making these holistic responses to steward cultural heritage, to protect wildlife and plants and animal life, to meet the climate change goals, and then just to make sure that our communities, our forests, our environments are thriving going forward. So thanks for that spark and that reminder. And I really appreciate thinking about the task force as of not an extractive process of knowledge. We're not asking for knowledge that we then take and implement, but it's really who wants to share their knowledge and then who wants to partner with us in the implementation. I think it's a bit of a different nuance, but a really important and exciting shift. So kudos to CAL FIRE for that. We really appreciate it. Mark, go ahead.
One other thing, Julian, is that we're working on is through normal consultation process, we're really trying to move that forward in the process and actively engage with projects. So it's really an engagement process instead of a consultation process. And so we're trying to move towards that engagement phase instead of a consultation phase, because consultation is, of course, here's our project, what do you think, right? Engagement is, hey, let's work together to complete this task together. And then we can take on more of a support role with cultural resources and cultural burning and that relationship. So
That's great.
We're shifting more towards that engagement process instead of the consultation process.
Yeah, I think it's a good distinction. They're both important, but when do you need which, and what seems to get you to where you want to go depending what your goal is. So I like that that idea of the consultation versus engagement. It's really helpful. And all of this work multiplies in so many different things, not just climate action. I mean, they're so interrelated. State parks, co-management of the new visitor center with the UROC, and the renaming of parks to their traditional cultural names. I think all of these bits together weave together a stronger, as you said, Len, web of life. Like it really does help bolster a greater community. Mark, I wonder if you could tell us how you see this carbon calculator being useful to California, and what kind of applications you see us really being able to take advantage of this tool to be helpful.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think as we've heard, California is already doing quite a bit. I think it would be useful for California, other states, just any agency and institution to use it as an additional tool as part of their real estate procurement. There's a very kind of institutional way real estate is conducted, and we've talked about behavioral change. One of the changes that we all need to make is how we procure our buildings, and considering the reuse or recycling of existing buildings can be an important part of solving the climate crisis. There's a substantial amount of carbon that can be saved by not building new all the time. It's been said we're not going to build our way out of the climate crisis. So the less new building we do, the fewer materials we extract from the earth and manufacture, the better. So recycling buildings makes sense that way. And the second part of your question?
How do you think we'll be able to use it in the work that we do? Like, how does this translate to cultural heritage, historic properties?
Well, it really helps to foster an appreciation of vernacular building and to learn the lessons of vernacular building, built back in a time when there was no energy. So people still wanted to be comfortable. So they learned how to work with the environment. And we, speaking of behavioral change, we may have to do some of our own work by redefining what we think comfortable is, because mechanically we can define it precisely at 72 degrees, 50% humidity. There may have to be a little more latitude in the future about what we consider to be comfort.
Thanks for that. I keep hearing in different circles that there's different proposals to have carbon reduction goals in the built environment in the state and different places around the world. And within those discussions, there's conversations of how to measure that and whether it's on a block by block basis. And I think about San Francisco as an example and how you would cordon off a block and say, okay, this block has to reduce its carbon emissions by 20%. And how you would begin, these kinds of tools would be helpful to understand where the real savings could be and the contributory role of retaining historic properties. I think any built environment rather than removing new. So, and I also think we're going to have to challenge ourselves as preservationists to understand how to adapt buildings for a lower carbon output and still retain their significance and integrity that really makes them special. And I think that's a challenge that we all have before us. What I loved about, Mark, about the task force that you sat on for the Climate Heritage Network is the international thinking that was going on, and there were carbon calculators that were being developed from partners in Ireland and in the UK, and just how that collaboration of do we support a single carbon calculator? Do we support values of carbon calculators? But what was the maximum benefit in this space was really something that you and the task force took head on, and I think made some really good progress and have some information sharing that that was really, really well done and continues. I think this is going to continue right past COP26, and the whole conversation will keep moving.
There are many tools that are being used. Most of them focus on new construction. That certain countries who are trying to get ahead of all this are developing their own policies and trying to create their own tools as a result. So there's a lot of common effort, and there are different ways to do it. But we chose to focus on one tool more as an illustration, but it's a useful tool. And the thing that limits its usefulness is it needs to be adapted for each country, each climate region, which is what's being done now. They're accumulating data so that it can just be more useful internationally. And we need to just talk more and promote it, the idea of recycling buildings and reusing buildings instead of new construction.
Right. And as we're having this meeting, the Terra conference, the mud building conference, international conference is going on in New Mexico. And so there's a whole other conversation about buildings that probably contribute little to nothing to the carbon footprint, but traditional building types and how those play a role in both cultural heritage and supporting communities, both tangibly and intangibly, as well as being sort of climate friendly, and the idea that how can these kinds of buildings be used, or an example of maybe a new kind of architecture type or a renew kind of architecture type that we might want to consider in other areas that are suffering increased desertification. We have one question from Dorothy Wong, and she asks, what is the status of the California Office of Historic Preservation's project and the GIS inventory of all the resources in the state? I think what you're asking is, we have the California Historic Information Resources System, CRIS, system that exists in nine centers around the state, hosted at UCs and California State Universities. And then our office is the 10th we are undergoing an effort to support all of the 9 centers to digitize fully their records, as well as digitizing our own records in our office and then keeping up with the backlog. A couple of things I think have been helpful in that space is during COVID, we put together, for our office anyway, an electronic submission system so that all documents come to us electronically. And that's really helped us. It's really helped us with the paper backlog to put things into the system faster. But we are currently still seeking, as we're digitizing as much as we can with excess fees that are collected at the centers. And at the end of every year, when our office has any budget surplus, we put it towards more digitization so that we can increase the percentage of records that are actually in digital form. We're still continuing to actively pursue the development of a single system in our office that will put all of these resources into one space, have it be available with security and confidentiality barriers, of course. We want to absolutely be conscious of that. Available desktop, to have a filing system with our office if you're sending a consultation in, that you can follow where it is as it works, so workflow process. And we're very close, we're very hopeful that that some of the funding opportunities that we've been diligently pursuing will come to fruition in the next couple of, certainly by the end of the year, we're hopeful, and we can finish up the container for all of that digitization, put it into a single system, and make that information more available faster, won't be subject to closures when there are disasters, wildfires, floods, these kinds of things. Our centers have gone to closure like the rest of us during COVID. So how can we make sure this information is available, is ready, is accessible quickly? Our hope is that by doing that, we cut down on the time it takes for people to understand what the resources are in a location earlier in their planning process rather than in their entitlements process. So that information will be more available when Len's building a fire management plan, or when State Parks is going to be figuring out how they're going to put more cabins in a park, that this information will be available as you're planning and getting the funding for your projects, rather than when you're at the tail end of consultation to get your clearances under the state or federal preservation laws, in addition to the others that have to happen, so that we can incorporate, steward, understand cultural heritage better in these projects, and just meet the needs of the projects or the agencies in a better way. So I hope that answers your question. The State Historical Resources Commission, who is responsible for the fee assessment, has this as an agenda item on every one of their commission meetings. I give a report in that space, and then once a year we do a deeper dive, usually at the December, January meetings. All of those recordings are available online if you go to our website. So that's a good place to look for updates if you're interested in following along. But I've been working on this system for 15 years. We used to say before there's a wildfire and the governor calls. Now we know that these emergencies are here, and we really want to make sure that we get that information into the hands of everybody that needs it, so that we can do a better job about accommodating cultural heritage and still meeting the missions of our serving our public. And then the second question you had, Dorothy, is our office keeping track of historic resources that are being destroyed in disasters such as Greenville? And the answer is no. We don't have that. Surprisingly, we don't have that as part of our authority, but we recognize that it's happening in small bits. Different agencies are collecting it. Once in a while, we'll get somebody that removes something for one of the registers because it's been destroyed, but it is something that's top of mind. It's an absolutely important thing for partnerships to think about. And I think we're absolutely interested in figuring out how to make that more systematic, robust, and known, so we can really understand what's been lost, and also just to make sure that our records are clear and helpful to the folks that need them for current projects. So the second question is no, but it is on top of mind, and we're anxious to work with partners to understand, like FEMA, Cal OES, and others, to understand how we can have a more dedicated process to getting that information. So I hope that answers your question. We have a question from Kimberly Wooten at Caltrans asking, how does the panel see the tie between cultural resources, heritage, climate change, and responsible economic growth in the state? Big question. I'll just quickly say that I think Amanda Hansen talked to that specifically as those three things absolutely being the goals of this administration. And how do we do that? And I'll just quickly add that the CRIS system, as you asked us about, Dorothy, thank you, I think is one way that we can help do that, just by making the information accessible and more readily available to make agencies help them work faster and better and more informed. I think we talk to folks at Cal OAS all the time in Cal Fire who say, if we knew where these resources are, where we could create our fire breaks in a different space, because once they're lost, especially tribal cultural resources, we can't get them back. So I think we have this amazing support within our community and state government and our federal partners and our local government partners to say, we'd like to not destroy heritage. How do we do that better? And so we're working towards that. If anybody else has anything they want to add about your specific seats and what you're looking at as far as culture, climate change, and economic growth, please jump in.
Maybe I'll say just a couple of things. I don't know if it hits it quite squarely where the questioner was asking, but one of the crossovers for me and my sort of work portfolio is the transition away from fossil fuels and into the renewable energy future, including land-based solar and wind, and then also the new initiative for offshore wind. We also have some platforms being planned for decommissioning, both in state waters, the 4 platforms in state waters, and then also the federal waters, outer continental shelf. The feds are starting to undertake a study for decommissioning oil platforms. And then I'm sorry, I just had a moment of fogginess. Did I mention Diablo Canyon? So those are areas where, you think about a sustainable future combating climate change, but it's sort of then a disconnect to say, well, that also is going to require a lot of infrastructure, like building things. And that is true, but then also it's opportunities to protect heritage or revitalize heritage. We've got a lot of interest by local tribal governments in the property that is owned by PG&E around the Diablo Canyon power plant. And we also are, looking to rehabilitate and restore, and then potentially look for uses of the various onshore facilities associated with the state oil and gas platforms. And so we're in dialogue with some of the local coastal tribes about, the simplest way to look at it is sort of the ancestral land return or the land back movement. So those things are sort of protecting culture, adapting to climate change, but then also sitting with the nexus of, jobs and community revitalization for not only tribal communities, but the sort of local communities at large, and the potential sustainable economies and the improvements to local economies. Just as a quick example, the proposed sale notice for the offshore wind potential lease areas put out by the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management is giving credits to lease bidders for community benefits. And so I just sort of view all of those things that the state and the federal administration right now are really looking to see where those pieces can all fit together, and recognizing, with this example of the lease sale, that it's not just about who's the highest bidder giving the most money into the federal coffers. It's like, we may take a person that didn't offer the highest bid on the lease, but they had the best community benefit package. And part of that community benefit package is, local jobs, and then preservation of in particular coastal indigenous communities, and sort of helping revitalize those communities and offer economic opportunities.
I have a question online if you'd like me to present it right now. It's on YouTube. It's coming from YouTube, actually.
Sure.
I can answer a little bit of that previous question. Can we?
Great.
wanna do that
Please
first?
do,
Yeah,
Len.
of course. Yep.
So for the previous one for CAL FIRE, you know, the big thing that we do is with projects, fuel reduction projects, and with the emergency response, right? And so that connection or that nexus is about that engagement. And that's where we've been going, is a more involvement with cultural heritage resources to protect them. And then to, of course, document them like you're doing with Chris. You know, we're looking at a digital system as well within CAL FIRE for the state responsibility area of where the sites are. So then during that emergency, we have that better awareness to protect the resources, as you mentioned, because it's difficult sometimes, and it's a really high importance timely wise to know where those resources are. So we're working on that in order to protect against climate change, because we do see the climate changing and we see these catastrophic wildfires occurring. And by having that connection to where the resources are, we have a better chance to protect them. And then with responsible economic growth, CAL FIRE has been really working towards a workforce capacity, you know, increase within natural resources, and that includes cultural resource workforce as well. And so CAL FIRE is working on several fronts for those issues. You know, it is a slow process, of course, but we are working towards it.
Thank you so much. That's so good. John, do you want to get the question give us the question?
Yes, and I think Len just addressed most of that question, but I'll present it again just in case there's anything you could expound on. So Theo was asking online, first of all, he says CAL FIRE is great at putting out fires, but with these recent mega fires comes mega impacts with thousands of miles of dozer lines going in every year now. It is hard to know where cultural resources are located when fires are raging. And what is CAL FIRE doing to contribute towards management of cultural and tribal resources during suppression activities?
So exactly. So one of the things that we do beforehand is, in several units, they have a pre-operations meeting with local tribes to really identify if there are new sites, and they're kept confidential on maps to show, okay, this is an area of cultural resource. It isn't always identified as to what that cultural resource is, because it's not necessary. It's necessary to know that we need to try to avoid it with the dozer line, right? We need to try to avoid it with where the fire is going, right? And so that's the important communication and relationship that we try to encourage with the local tribes and the local CAL FIRE unit, in order to have that awareness of those sites in order to protect them. Because oftentimes these fires are huge, 500,000 acres, 1 million acres, right? And they're raging, and it's very difficult to look at that, you know, where we're going to put in the suppression lines and then say, okay, now here are the sites. And even though we often only have 24, 48 hours ahead of time to try to put in some of these dozer lines, we do reference the site maps in order to try to avoid potential impacts to resources. Unfortunately, as we all know, a lot of resources are unknown as to their location. And when we scrape the top of the dirt off, we find that there's a site. You know, and then we have a whole protocol system with engagement with the tribes to say, okay, how can we best put this back into its, you know, best situation after the fire, you know, for suppression and repair. And so we have a whole process on the back end as well. But on some of these mega fires, the biggest damage is the fire itself.
Thank you for that, Len. I think it's really an important point. And I will say, just from our perspective, when we get the consultations that set up the projects or we work on programmatic agreements, the importance of meaningful consultation with the tribes is to set these ideas and protocols about when tribes want to be, and what areas they would like to be consulted with, and what that their interaction looks like, and also when tribal monitors should be on site, and how that happens, so that partnership again, and that information sharing and co-management is happening. So it's in our office, how we can help with all of that is the importance of making sure that tribes are meaningfully consulted with in the processes that we manage, and so that the agencies and the tribes have that information shared, the understandings agreed to in advance. So when something happens and go needs to happen, they can act quickly and work together, and everybody, I think we get the better benefits from those processes. Do we have any other, Kathleen?
I just wanted to add that when the fires are within California State Parks properties, we have resource advisors, natural and cultural resource advisors that are sometimes actually going out with the dozers and trying to identify the resources to be avoided, as well as providing maps and GIS information. And they're also involved with the repair after the suppression work is done. And so we have some highly trained archaeologists and historians that put themselves out to go out there and protect the resources. I just wanted to give them a shout out.
That's great. We also hear from tribes, Len, you probably know about this program more than we do, about the red card, getting red card licensed to be able to participate safely and collaboratively that way. And that's something I know little about, but essentially, as I understand it, it's an intensive training that gives people the opportunity or the ability to be on site when the fire activities are happening, so that everyone understands what's good. And I think that safety element is so important in all the work that we do, especially on the ground, to remember that we want to be inclusive, but we also want to make sure that people are safe.
Yeah, with CAL FIRE, we put through kind of a basic fire awareness training for our resource advisors in order so then they can be alongside that bulldozer. And so when they're putting in, or we know we're near a site, in many sites, it's just the tip of the iceberg of the site where you know about. And so it's really important that we have those resource advisors, those archaeologists, those environmental scientists or specialists right there on site, on the fire line. And that's a dangerous place to be. And so we give them that fire behavior awareness training in order to protect them, because unfortunately in California, with the fires being so catastrophic, being so explosive, a change in wind direction could really be catastrophic. And so we want to make sure that the people that are out in the field are prepared and safe, including our resource advisors.
Yeah, absolutely. So important. I don't see any questions from our audience. Does anyone have any questions? Raise your hand or put it in the Q&A. Well, thanks to everyone who joined us today. Thank you, CPF, for partnering with us in this as always, and being with us the whole step through the whole sort of journey of cultural heritage and climate action. I just want to say again that, for me, the excitement of this task force is that it's one of the few and the first in government, particularly a government as large as ours, that's really beginning to understand, think about, talk about, connect. We don't know what we don't know, but just the openness and the willingness to learn and share is monumental. And I'm so proud of the work that our partners do. Thank you all for joining us to share the amazing projects. There are more that we're looking for, hoping to get. If anybody has any they'd want to share with us, please reach out to us by email. But we're going to continue this work. California is going to continue to lead the way within the state and the nation and the world with our involvement in these partnerships that we formed. We encourage you to join us. Tell us what you like. Tell us what you don't like. We do this for our communities, and we need your voices and your participation so that we're sure to be sure we're targeting towards the things that you all find important. And I think I want to close by, and of course, thank you, Jesse and Mark in our office, always for your good work and your participation. I want to share one thing that I don't even think the group knows, is there's an international organization called United Cities and Local Governments, UCLG. They are a big player in the space of cultural heritage and in climate change. They represent cities and local governments around the world. This year is their 5th annual awards for Culture 21. That's their big cultural event. They launched the call in May for applications to this award about what are people doing in the space of cultural heritage and climate action. We were invited to participate. We submitted an application. There were 101. Our application was accepted and included in the Innovation and Sparks category, which is really exciting. And we were also invited to submit the rest of our application for the second part. So this coming week, the jury will be looking at the second round of submissions. And I just wanted you all to know that UCLG reached out to us. They know about our task force. We talk about it in the Climate Heritage Network, the work that our state agencies are doing on behalf of our public. And they're recognizing, they did so because they recognize your efforts and the efforts of your leadership and our governor to really begin to understand all the different places that climate action can benefit from, that we need to accelerate our action, and the importance of culture and communities in these conversations. It's not just lip service, we're actually all doing it. And in this collaborations, we're learning from each other and how to do better together. So really excited about that award being at least going through the second round, and just the request to apply because of the recognition of all the work that you all did with us together during COVID. So it's a celebration of all of you and the efforts that our colleagues who aren't with us today and their contributions, and that really makes me so happy and so proud of all that we do every day. CPF, do you guys have anything on closing that you'd like to share with us?
No, that was a great conclusion. I just wanted to second Julianne's thanks for everybody here today. It's been a really enlightening experience for me and my colleague, I'm sure, as well, as I see her on the screen now. We do have,
yeah, thanks so much. It's been wonderful.
Yeah, and we have the recordings available. We will have the recordings of it. In fact, they're available right now on YouTube and Facebook if you'd like to go back and rewatch anything. And I'm guessing that the SHPO will post to their website as well. We can send you a link on where to find that. So we look forward to more conversations like this.
Yeah, we absolutely will. And please use our website as your climate action cultural heritage resource list. Will as a place to hold information. We'll be pointing to the other efforts of our state agencies and things that might be interesting to you. And then we're also planning a speaker series sometime later this year in advance of COP27, the convening of peoples. The UN's big climate change conference is in Sharm el Sheikh, Egypt in November. And so with our agency partners, our natural resources agency partners, we're looking at, and this task force looking at a speaker series. So to do some more deep diving in these very specific ways. So if you're interested, you have ideas or thoughts, you want to input and join us, and stay tuned too for more listening sessions. We really want to, we're going to do another session with the tribes, have the same conversation, and then really just try to get some information before we finish that report to tell you where we've been and where we're going. So really appreciate everyone. Thanks again, CPF, for always being so seamless and such a great partner. And I'm just always so inspired by all of you every day. So thanks everybody for your work and your partnership. And thank you too for the folks that stayed with us for the period. We really appreciate your joining us today.
Thank you so much.
Have a great weekend, everyone.
You too.
Right. Take care. Thanks, everybody.